Thank you. It's a great honour to be here, and thank you to Giuseppe for inviting me, and of course to the KSMA, of which I was a trustee for some 17 years, until around 2014. Now, Giuseppe mentioned my biography of Keats just now. That was published in 2012 and took many years in preparation. And the first stage of the research for the book was in Naples in 2005. I came here and walked the streets that Keats might have seen, particularly the Via Santa Lucia, which is just round the back here, 2 minutes walk, where Severn and Keats stayed for a week in early November of 1820. From their large room, they could see Vesuvius from the window. Keats wrote 2 letters to London from Naples. Both of them are very unhappy letters. One was to Mrs. Braun, the mother of his fiancée, Fanny Braun. The other was to his friend Charles Brown, describing his deep unhappiness at having to leave London and leave his fiancée, Fanny. As you'll know, Keats is above all a poet of prospect and promise and ambition, thinking of the cliff of poesy towering above him, as he said at the start of his career. Starting Endymion as a long poem that would test his powers of imagination, and then setting about his epic Hyperion, which would take him to the moment when Apollo, the god of poetry, takes on his divinity and by implication becomes a presider of all the poets that were to follow in the Western tradition, including, of course, John Keats himself. At Naples, there was only one thing ahead of John Keats. The poet who had always been looking ahead now had really no future, and as he says in one of those letters, no way back. As he said to Mrs. Braun, "I do not feel in the world." Already a sense that he was living, as he said, a posthumous life. However, on his first morning in the Villa di Londra, Joseph Severn, the painter who accompanied him, said Keats was much recovered. During his time in Naples, he took a carriage along the Via de Toledo, then as now the main street of the city. He went up Capo di Monte and surveyed the Bay of Naples with the view across to Vesuvius. And he watched some workmen eating macaroni, a glorious sight, as he reported to London. On the 5th of November, they watched soldiers, again, just around the corner in the piazza there, outside San Francesco di Paola. They watched soldiers parading, and this is a reminder that the city of Naples was in a state of revolution at the time. They went to the theatre of San Carlo, Teatro San Carlo, where they listened to a performance of Pacini's Baron of Dolzheim. And if Keats looked up at the ceiling, he would see Giuseppe Camerano's pageant of Apollo again, introducing the greatest poets to the goddess Minerva. I can't think of a better painting to have on the ceiling of that theatre for John Keats. So we have that painting, we have poetry, the presence of Apollo, and we have Pacini's music, all in the midst of a liberal revolution. Couldn't possibly have been a better week for Keats, were it not that the statues of soldiers on each side of the stage in the theatre, as Keats thought of them, suddenly started to move and walked off stage, and he realized the performance was being guarded by the military. And he said, "I'm not going to stay in this city because of its miserable politics." And they set off to Rome on the 8th of November. When I was here in 2005, I hired a car, and after my days in Naples, I followed the route that Keats took from Naples to Rome. And I'm going to take you on that trip, and then look back for a moment at his days in Naples by way of drawing this short talk to a close. They travelled in basically a horse and cart. It was called a vettura, and they left Naples heading north along a road lined with myrtle and laurel and cyclamen and Italian pines, covering, I think it's 40 kilometres, to Capua, which, as you'll know, was formerly a thriving Roman town on the busy Via Appia. And the next morning, they started north, I suppose, approximately, on the eternal road that would take them through vineyards and olive groves and over mountains reputed to be infested with banditti. And then, as now, everywhere were remains of deep antiquity. Roman buildings overgrown at the roadside, watchtowers precarious on craggy pinnacles, isolated crosses and chapels, and for Keats, as he was sitting in the back of the vettura, a constantly changing skyline. From the Capuan plain, they entered a landscape of hills and deep clefts overgrown with chestnut trees. Their road climbed to the village of Cascano and then made a gradual descent towards the coast, where they may have spent their second night at the lonely inn near St. Agatha. They continued to Roman Minturnae, where they could see vestiges of the amphitheatre and the aqueduct, and so on along the beautiful coastline to Moli di Gaeta, now Formia, where they may have spent the Friday night. Now, as Keats knew very well, Cicero was assassinated here in 43 BC, and his tomb and gardens and baths were popular attractions. But for Keats more particularly, by reviving such scenes from antiquity, Italy was sending Keats back to his first encounters with the classics at his school in Enfield. Lempriere's classical dictionary, the Aeneid, which he translated, and of course, George Chapman's translation of Homer, which occasioned his great sonnet. Roman ruins at the roadside also reflected his own deplorable physical state as a victim of tuberculosis. When Keats and Seven woke on Saturday the 11th of November, they faced a dauntingly steep ascent into bandit country. This was steep enough even in the little car that I'd hired. Wild, rugged and inaccessible. But I think most dangerous for Keats was the sudden drop in temperature as they came up from the coast. For at any moment, cold air or a jolt from their carriage could induce a hemorrhage. This was a very, very risky journey to have taken. So he furled himself in a rug as they entered Itri with its massive citadel, and then went on over the pass at Monte Grande. Now, if you go there, you can see the ancient cobbles over which Keats most likely bumped and lurched. They're still visible there, worn and rutted by hundreds of years of cartwheels, where Via Appia winds down among terraces of olive trees and dry stone walls. When I was there in November of 2005, there were still wildflowers blooming at the roadside, there were butterflies dancing under the trees, and lizards were basking in the autumn sun. So a kind of idea there of what Keats might have seen as he passed by. Down from the mountains, they came to another fertile valley of vines and groves of olive, orange and lemon around Fondi, where the inn was said to have been a nobleman's palace. This was their fourth night on a journey that most travellers of the day could complete in a couple of days, sometimes even less than that. From Fondi, they came to Terracina. Keats, if he looked up, could see on the heights the ruined sanctuary of Jupiter, and looming overhead as they rounded the headland, a massive cliff that was quarried by Roman engineers to make way for the Via Appia. Here Keats's passport was visaed good for entry to the Papal States, and they began a long straight stretch across the Pontine marshes. It's worth remembering, just by way of pausing, that Keats's passport was set up so that he could get back to England if he recovered. Tuberculosis was known as the most invariably fatal of diseases, from which remarkable recoveries were possible. Hence the torturing exchange of letters from Rome, where Seven in particular was writing to London, and the 3-week lapse it took for Seven's letters to get to Fanny Brawne and Mrs. Brawne and Charles Brown, offering hopes about Keats's possible recovery. And by the time the letters had been received in London, of course, he had taken a turn for the worse. There's a very moving letter from Leigh Hunt saying, "I hope to the last," which he wrote a week after Keats had died. As they crossed the Pontine Marshes, to the right were fenland and distant mountains. To the left was the Decenovium, a Roman canal edged with bulrushes where herons stalked. The town of Mesa was some 10 miles from Terracina, and perhaps they spent Sunday night here, close to the ruin of a Roman way station, before pushing on 25 miles to Velletri on the lower slopes of the Colli Albani. At this point, they reached the last stage of their journey. As they started across the Colli Albani on Tuesday, the 14th of November, autumn had advanced and the air was chilly. All of the way, Seven had attempted to rally Keats's spirits, picking bunches of flowers from the wayside and laughing at his puns. From Velletri, they looked out across the Roman Campagna and glimpsed a dim outline of Rome itself. Ahead of them lay the long, unswerving descent of the Via Appia, surrounded with Roman graves on each side. Charles Dickens came here in 1845, and he likened the Campagna's mounds and heaps and hills of ruin and dark undulating surface to a broad, dull Lethe flowing around the walls of Rome and separating it from all of the world. As Dickens returned to the city, the descent along the Via Appia that Keats had taken some 25 years earlier seemed like a passage into a ruined world on which the sun would never rise again. This forlorn landscape, populated with Roman graves, would shadow Keats's state of mind as he lingered in his final months at Piazza di Spagna. Like so much of Rome at the time, the city was, as it were, overgrown and half underground. The Colosseum surrounded with earth that has had to be moved away for us to be able to see the ruin as it is now. Rather like Keats imagining himself already underground and imagining the flowers growing above his grave. Well, as I said, I don't want to linger on these unhappy associations of Keats's last month in Italy. But if we look back from the Piazza di Spagna, I think we can see Keats's 7 days at Naples as a moment of remarkably good fortune, overseen by Apollo and the 9 Muses that you could see in Camerano's painting at the theatre, and indeed on the fresco outside the theatre, where you have the figure of Apollo again and the Muses. After his long voyage to Naples, Keats had enjoyed a week of happiness, let's hope, with good food, with music, with theatre, with puns, and with poetry, and with Keats apparently in good health before the final phase of his illness set in at Rome. And I thought we might have a poem as a surprise just to finish up this little talk for you this evening. I've been looking through and wondering what might be a good poem to read. "My dear Reynolds," he says, "you must forgive me all this ranting, but the fact is I cannot write sense this morning. However, you shall have some. I will copy my last sonnet. When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books in charactery hold like full garners the full ripened grain, when I behold upon the night's starred face huge, cloudy symbols of a high romance, and feel that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance. And when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink. I must take a turn and then write to Teignmouth. Remember me to all, not excepting yourself. Your sincere friend, John Keats. Thank you.